Hi, I'm Don Dickson, and I'm glad you're joining me today for another session on a masterclass. We're talking about the right stuff. It's pretty much accepted today that in order to go fishing, have some success, catch some fish, we're going to need some equipment. And that's what we're trying to filter out right now. What equipment does the best jobs? Now, the last time we talked, we covered rods. We said we need trolling rods, we need casting rods. We sort of made a point of mentioning that we need to troll and cast both in order to be successful. All species, all over the country, bulk of the season. So we need to have two different types of equipment, trolling and casting. So we covered that. But now we're getting into lures. And I want you to understand that of all of the myriad of lures that have ever been built, past, present, and the ones that will be built in the future, each and every one of them fall into one of four categories. In other words, what I'm trying to do here is simplify this lure selection in your mind so that you can break it down and know what you need to have in your box when you go out there to control all your depths and all your speeds. So here we go. I want you to understand there are only four types of baits. There's only four different types. Every lure was ever built, ever, and every lure that will ever be built falls into one of four categories, and I'm going to define them for you. First, topwater. We all know what a topwater bait is. 2, weedless lures. 3, free-swimming, bottom-bumping lures, otherwise known as crankbaits. And fourthly, jump baits. Those are the baits that are meant to be jumped off the bottom, returned to the bottom on a taut line, and jumped again, jump it, and that's how you fish it back to the boat. So we got four types: topwater, weedless, crankbaits, jump baits. Now what I'm going to do is try to put them in order of importance for you. And what I mean by that is, what percentage of time will Don Dickson or Buck Perry be fishing a topwater bait? What percentage of the time would Don Dickson or Buck Perry be fishing a weedless bait? What percentage of the time would we be fishing crankbaits? What percentage of the time would we be fishing a jump bait? Now, I'm going to take the average, all species, all year round, and give you the answers to those questions. Now, I know I'm going to get a lot of flack on this, but this is the way it is. And when I break it down for you, I want you to understand the percentage of time to use these four different types of lures is based upon me and Buck, and hopefully you, looking and arriving at the school of fish. I'm not talking about catching one individual fish up in the grass. I'm not talking about that. If you fish in the grass all day and you catch 3 fish, whoopie dang, you caught 3 fish in the grass. But I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the percentage of time Buck Perry and Don Dickson are going to fish in an area where we're using a topwater bait and expect to run into the school of fish. Okay, that being said, topwater baits, 1% of the time. Now, understand when I tell you this, nobody, I mean nobody, not my wife, not my kids, nobody likes catching a fish on topwater bait any more than I do. I love it. You know, from the time I was a kid, you know, I used to use the old Arbogast jitterbug, a small variety, fishing at night, drifting down the Allegheny River in Pittsburgh, catching a few little smallmouth bass. You know, they come up, strike that lure on the surface. Nothing like it. It's great, great fun. I love it. And during our summer schools, we'd be up there early enough. The smallmouth would be spawning. My wife liked to go out with her little pop-R, you know, and catch some smallmouth on top early in the morning. Of course, we released them all there spawning. But there's nothing like it. It's a lot of fun. But how often does Buck Perry and Don Dickson expect to run into the school of fish where we're living it out on a school of big fish throwing a topwater bait? I can tell you, 1% of the time. And that percentage takes in the spawn, but normally we don't fish the spawn. So you could say I use topwater bait even less than 1% of the time. But in all fishing, for all people all over the country, fishing spawn or not fishing spawn, running into a group of big fish on top water, 1% bait. That's all it is, 1% bait. Number 2, weedless baits. Now, when I think of a weedless bait, I'm thinking of a spinner bait, you know, single blade, double blade, Colorado, willow blade, doesn't matter, but I'm normally thinking of a spinner bait. It's the one I use the most. A lot of the guys that are fishing bass, the largemouth bass fishing, a lot of those guys will use really a jig, skirt, or if they're pitching a pig and jig, that kind of thing. They'll have a weighted lure that's meant to be jumped and move through the water like that, but they'll rig it weedless, or they'll rig a plastic worm weedless. I'm not referring to those baits, because to me those baits are really jump baits. But a lot of the guys do rig them weedless and fish them in the weeds. So again, how often does Don Dickson and Buck Perry expect to find a school of big hog fish catching them on a weedless bait? Same as topwater, about 1% of the time. And again, that takes in the early season, the pre-spawn, the spawn, and late fall. And again, that also includes the late season. When we talk about weather and water and seasonal movements, I'm going to have a discussion with you about how really some of the shallowest movements of the year happen in the fall, even shallower than the spawning season. So we'll talk about that at another time. So now we've covered topwater and weedless, 1% each. And then we come to the third category, which is crankbaits. Now, crankbait, the real way to define it is it's a free-swimming, bottom-bumping lure. Free-swimming and bottom-bumping. That's what a crankbait is. There's a ton of them being made, and after Buck Perry hit the scene, really in the 50s, but mainly late 60s and 70s and moving on, when he was educational editor of Fishing Facts, more and more notice was given to the deep water tendencies of a fish, thanks to Buck. And some of the manufacturers started building these deeper diving crankbaits. Free swimming, bottom bumping lures. Now, there's a bunch of them today, but there's none of them quite like the spoon plug. And the spoon plug is the one I've already told you, I don't know, 1,000 times so far. This is the one I use, but I use it for a certain reason. Keep in mind, what we're trying to do out there is create depth and speed. That's the whole deal, create depth and speed. Which one is most effective at creating all of the different depths and all of the different speeds, both trolling and casting? Spoon plug, by far. Not even a comparison. And we're going to run a little old Super 8 movie I made once before about the ultimate lure. I want you to really understand, full blast, understand how effective a spoon plug is. So we're going to run that for you sometime soon, so you get the picture. But the spoon plug is a crankbait, but there's a bunch of others as well. This one does the best job, and I'll explain why in a minute. So before I move off of crankbaits, let me put a percentage on it for you, because we said topwater 1%, weedless 1%. Crankbaits are a 90% bait. 90% of the time, Buck Perry and Don Dickson is running into the school of fish on a crankbait. Now the depths could be quite different. Could be 14 feet, could be 17 feet, could be 25 feet, could be 35, could be 47. But we're running into them with a crankbait, and we're catching them on a crankbait. Not a topwater bait, and not a weedless bait. We're catching them on a crankbait. It's a 90% lure. Bulk of the season, all species. I'm not just talking about a bass. I know the bass are studied fish, but I'm talking about all species, including the walleye, including the slower fish that during the summer aren't so slow. I'm catching walleyes on wireline and the 700 spoon plug, big hogs at 47 feet of water with a bottom bumping, free swimming, bottom bumping lure. So the crankbaits, that's the ticket. That's the deal. It's the 90% bait. All right, so that brings us to the fourth category. Fourth category is a jump bait, and they're the second most important bait that we have. Now, in that, you can include jigs, hair jigs. You can include little jig heads with little rubber tails. You can include the plastic worms. All of these jump baits are meant to be fished pretty much in the exact same manner. The worm being a little bit slower than the others, can be worked slower. Now, so if you break down these 4 different types, we have topless. Topless.
Topless.
They're my favorite kind. What we just say, we've got 4 different types of baits. We've got topwater baits, which are 1%. I use 1% of the time. I think you're like me. I'm not in business catching fish 1% of the time. If I was, I'd fish topwater baits all day. Would I love to catch a ton of big fish on topwaters all the time? Yes. I'd probably like that more than you. But it just doesn't happen. So why am I going to waste my time? 1% bait. I'm not going to. I'm going to check it when it's called for. But after I check it, I'm not going to be long. I'm out of there. I'm going to find those fish. Now, a lot of guys, they'll fall in love with this casting piers like right here, casting these docks, and they just do it nonstop, regardless of what time of year. Fishing topwater baits. And so, let me just put it to you from Buckberry, 1% bait. It's not very important. It's fun, but it's not very important. In finding a school of fish. 2, weedless baits. My favorite weedless bait is a spinner bait. You know, 1 blade is a little faster bait than you can work a little slower with the 2 blades and so on and so forth. And it is sort of versatile. You can throw it in a weedy area and work it across the top. You can sink it a little subsurface and still have it run through the weeds pretty well. And then you get to maybe to an edge of a weed line up in a natural lake up north. You can let it sink to the bottom and then jig it back to the boat. It's pretty versatile. And that's the one I use the most when I'm fishing a weedless bait. And that's about 1% of the time over the course of a season. 3, the crankbaits. As you know, my favorite's the spoon plug. Number 4, the jump baits. We just talked about. They could be 3, 4 different types of jump baits. Now, in order to put this in perspective for you, I did a little research. I got it right here. I wrote it down this morning. I looked it up. And I want to share this with you because you're wondering, what lure should I buy? As a matter of fact, when I pulled out my notes, I'm going to give a shout out to ErnieMorris.com. A friend of mine, Tim Morris here, a local friend, he's got one of those big saltwater rigs. And he's taking me grouper fishing here, I think in the next week or so. So I give a shout out to Tim Morris at ErnieMorris.com. Anyway, I have a little notepad at the house that just happened to be his, and I wrote down, I did a little research, wrote this down. I went to Cabela's. I did a little shopping for you this morning. At Cabela's, in the category of topwater baits, there's 197. So you got 197 to choose from. And as I look through the 197, because I have, you know, the few that I have in my box are my favorites. You know, I've had them for a long time. Like I said earlier, my wife's favorite is a Pop R. At any rate, topwater baits, there's 197. And as I look through all of the pictures, just for fun, I knew most of them. Some of them are newer that I don't know and haven't seen before. It's amazing how they all look almost exactly the same. They haven't changed at all. Change a little paint different, you know, and a different name, and they have all these sexy names, you know. I won't even start naming them, but I looked through it and I just smiled. Yeah, it's a little topwater bait, little chugger, a little popper that you throw in there, and if that fish is there, you're going to take it every time. Every time. You don't have to have all 197 topwater baits. You only need a few. At any rate, then I looked at the weedless baits, and because spinner baits are my favorite kind of weedless bait, I looked up spinner baits, just spinner baits alone. 191 choices you have, excuse me. 191 different spinner baits. Amazing, they all look the same. They all do the same thing. Different color, different name, different maker. But I can see where your confusion is starting. We're already topwater and weedless, which is only combined 2% of the fishing you're going to be doing running into the school of fish, 2% of the time. You got 400 choices of lures. And we haven't even got started yet. Let's get to the crankbaits. Crankbaits, 454 different crankbaits. Now, of those crankbaits, finally, the manufacturers are starting to get the message that you need to have lures that are running deeper than 10 feet. Most of them say right on it, you know, maximum depth, 10 feet. Some say 15 feet. Wow, you're really getting deep. And they actually have some now, they advertise run to 20 feet. So you cast it out and you start to reel those crankbaits, and you keep reeling, and it starts going down and going down and going down. By the time you've got half of your cast back, it may hit that 20 feet and then start rising up when you bring it the rest of the way. That's their idea of a crankbait, free swimming, bottom bumping. You know how hard you got to work to try to control a depth with those baits? Ridiculous. With this bait, I can cast that bait right there. I had it in my hand a minute ago. I can cast this bait right here. It's a free swimming, bottom bumping lure, just like the ones I'm talking about, the other 454, except this one's made out of metal. You throw it into the deep water and you sink it down. I don't care if it's 60 feet. Once it's on the bottom, as long as I have a proper casting position, I can start cranking, and that lure will stay on the bottom all the way back to my boat. Not 10 feet, not 15 feet. Well, how about if my drop-off's at 45 feet? I got a lure I can cast to. I can cast it and hit that with this free swimming, bottom bumping lure at 45 feet. I can hit one at 35 feet. I can hit one at 27 feet. And all these other 454 varieties won't do it. So why would I buy one of these or 10 of these when all I need is one of these? I wouldn't. That's the reason I love spoon plug. And trolling, there's nothing that compares to these lures. I can control exact depths with the rods that we talked about, rods and reels, in the different lines, in trolling. I said 0 to 25 feet. If it's 22 feet, I've got a lure in with my no-bow line, a short line 800, I go exactly 22 feet. Let's say it's 24 and a half feet. I got a lure go exactly 24 and a half feet. Let's say it's 17 feet. I got the lure goes exactly to 17 feet. Let's say it's 15 and a half feet. I got a lure that will go to 15 and a half feet exactly with no bow trolling line. But let's say my feature that I'm trying to fish is 32 feet. I've got a lure with wire line, it goes 32 feet. If it's 37 feet or 35 feet or 46 feet, I've got a lure with wire line that'll do the job. It's called a spoon plug. People wonder why I use them all the time. Why do I have hundreds of spoon plugs in my possession? Because it does everything. And none of the others will. 454 of them won't do the job. But this one does. Keep that in mind. And not only that, these are the 90% lures. Here's the lure that we're going to be using when we run into the school of fish 90% of the time. Now, if I have a choice, catching fish 1% of the time or 90% of the time, that's not a choice. It's a silly question. Okay, so the last one we're going to check out for you is jump baits. Now, keep in mind, the jump bait, throw it out, sink it, and you jump it off the bottom, allow it to return to the bottom on a taut line. You jump it again, you keep moving it in that fashion back to the boat. Now, these lures were meant to check the slower speeds when fishing deep structure. But they are limited. If you try to use a jump lure and try to make it work faster, the faster you move it, the more it moves off the bottom and starts coming back to you that way, and you've lost your number one control. You've lost your depth control. So it can't be worked quickly. You can't work it fast. It's a slow bait to check slow speed controls in deep structure. So when we consider the jump baits, we first take a look at just jigs. 897 different jigs. Now if you actually look through, I didn't obviously look through 897 jigs. They all look the same. They all do the exact same thing. They just have different names, and they're made by different makers. But they're the same exact thing, and if fish don't know one from the other, I can promise you, he has no idea. You move it by him at the right speed, he strikes it. That's the way they do it. He doesn't try to figure out, well, was that number 892? And that one was made by so-and-so instead of so-and-so, so I think I'll strike this one. They can't rationalize things like human beings. They don't do that. If you move that by a fish at the right speed, as per his metabolism where he is, he will strike that bait 100% of the time. Doesn't care about the color either. When you're downstairs where the jump bait should be being used, everything's black to the fish anyhow. Now in this discussion of jump baits, I just mentioned jigs, but I also want to include the plastic worm in here because when it's really properly used, the only way I use it as a deep, slow speed, checking my slow speeds on deep structure when I'm fishing largemouth bass. But keep in mind it's 8% bait, but I took and I counted up all of the different plastic worms that they had for sale. 97 different varieties. Now that's really comical. How many different ways can you make a plastic worm? I mean, it's crazy. But what it is, it's filling your head with all of this with just the jump baits, an 8% bait, an important bait. We need this grouping of baits to be successful 100% of the time. But it's still just an 8% bait. But just at Cabela's alone, you got an 8% lure, you got 1,000 to choose from. Huh. They're making it really complicated, guys, when it's really pretty simple. So I thought I'd just, between the crankbaits, spinnerbaits, and topwaters just at Cabela's, giving them a little free advertising, there's over 2,000 baits that you could buy. Topwater baits, 1%. Weedless baits are 1%. And the jump baits are only 8%. So that's only 10% chance of those 3 different varieties. In fact, when you really conclude this all up, if you take topwater baits and you take weedless baits and you take jump baits, these 3 categories all do the job that they were designed to do. And they're all pretty much exactly the same. Topwater, weedless, jump baits, they're all the same. But they do the job they were designed to do. So we need to have a few. We need to have a few. But then we talk about the crankbaits. The crankbaits aren't the same. Even though the manufacturers are starting to get the message, they got to have some lures that get a little bit deeper. They're finally getting the message after 70 years, for goodness sake. But none of them do what the spoon plug does. Spoon plug I can take to any exact depth, casting and trolling, and control 99.9% of all of my depths and all of my speeds. The only one I can't control, I control with my jump baits. That's it. So the crankbait, there's no room for discussion as to which one you should buy. Okay, so in closing, I want to encourage you to go to Cabela's, go to Bass Pro Shops, go to Walmart, to wherever you want to go to buy your topwater baits, your weedless baits, and your jump baits. But when it comes to your crankbaits, there's only one place you can get these, Buck's Baits. And that's the reason that I have on my website, DonDicksonFishing.com. I have a little link there that says, what's in Don's tackle box? You click onto that link and it throws you over to Buck's Baits, and you can peruse everything they have over there. And when you're one of my customers, you get the best price. It's that simple. So I'm encouraging you to do that because there is only one that'll do what these lures will do. It's the only one that'll do it. So why would you go get something else? Doesn't make any sense. So with that being said, I appreciate you being with me today, and I encourage you to like us on Facebook and subscribe to our YouTube channel, and I appreciate you being here, and we'll see you the next time.